My name is Elise Marin. I'm 63. Christmas dinner at my son's house always feels more like a performance than a celebration matching napkins, gold chargers, and the kind of candlelight that makes even the mashed potatoes look self-conscious. Lydia, my daughter-in-law, loves perfection. She plans every detail as though the evening were a silent audition for a life she already believes she deserves. I've learned to smile through it to take my seat at the far end of the table and let the noise of their world roll over me. That night, the air smelled of rosemary and burnt sugar. Lydia wore a red silk dress that shimmered when she moved. Her voice carried like a bell through the room. Ethan sat beside her, laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny. He'd always done that when he was nervous. I could tell from the way his hand fidgeted with his wine glass that he was bracing for something. Across the table, their little boy Jack pushed peas around his plate and whispered a song only he could hear. I asked him softly about school. Lydia answered for him before he could speak. "He's thriving," she said, her smile just wide enough to remind me that she was in charge of every conversation here. I kept my eyes on the carved turkey, waiting for the moment to pass. The years had taught me that small silences often save you from bigger arguments. When dessert arrived, a pecan pie I'd once baked every Christmas until Lydia declared hers lighter and more modern, I thought I might finally slip away unnoticed. Then Lydia set down her fork, folded her manicured hands, and looked straight at me. "We should probably tell you now," she said. "No point pretending." The room shifted. Ethan's laugh died mid-breath. Jack stopped humming. Lydia's tone was light, almost playful, but her eyes didn't match. "We changed all the locks," she said. "You don't have a home anymore." For a second, the sound in the room collapsed, the ticking clock, the faint clink of silverware, even the rustle of the tree lights. I felt the words land like snow on my skin, cold and weightless. Ethan's face flushed. "Lyd," he started, but she touched his wrist and he stopped. "It's not personal," she added quickly. "You know, for security reasons. We've been reorganizing things." I looked at her, then at my son. His eyes darted to the tablecloth. I thought about the 27 years I'd lived in that house, the evenings patching drywall beside my husband, the endless tax bills, the mortgage payments I'd covered when Ethan was in college. It was strange how betrayal could arrive wrapped in domestic grace, delivered with linen napkins and Christmas cheer. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply folded my napkin, smoothed the edge with my fingers, and said, "Then I wish you both a peaceful night." I stood steady enough to make the chair legs scrape against the tile. Jack looked at me confused. Lydia began to clear plates that didn't need clearing. Ethan murmured something I didn't hear. On my way to the door, I passed the framed photo in the hallway. Tom and me on the porch of that same house, paint-stained and grinning the day we'd finally finished rebuilding the roof after the hurricane. Behind the glass, we looked so sure of what would last. Outside, the cold air bit at my cheeks. The neighborhood was quiet except for the low hum of Christmas lights from other homes, families gathered around trees, voices rising in warmth. I stood under the porch lantern for a moment, its light spilling across the steps, and waited to feel something rage, grief, anything. Instead, I felt hollow, like a wall stripped of its picture frames. As I reached my car, snow began to fall soft and uneven. I brushed a few flakes from the windshield and caught my reflection in the glass, older than I remembered, steadier too, the kind of face that had seen storms and outlived them. When I turned the key, the engine stuttered before catching. In the rearview mirror, I could see their house glowing through the trees. I thought of the locks Lydia had changed, of the keys, still on my ring, heavy with useless metal. I didn't throw them away. I set them in the cup holder and drove into the quiet streets of Charleston, letting the city lights blur against the dark water. Somewhere between the bridge and the river road, I realized I wasn't going back tonight, or maybe ever. The cold crept through my sleeves, but it wasn't unbearable. There was something strangely clean about it, the way the air cut straight through the past without asking permission. When I reached the edge of the marsh, I parked and turned off the headlights. The tide was low, the reeds bending in the wind like old secrets. I sat there until the dashboard clock blinked past midnight, the silence folding around me. My phone buzzed once against my palm. A message. Lydia's name on the screen. I didn't open it yet. I just watched the glow fade the phone going dark again and thought of how a single message could begin or end everything. Then I unlocked the screen and read. The text came just after midnight, when the city had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed tired. Lydia's name lit up my phone, the glow spreading across the small room I was renting on Queen Street. I hesitated before opening it, already knowing what it would say. Don't come back. 3 words. Cold. Efficient. I read them twice, then a third time, letting their shape sink in. Beneath them was the timestamp 12:07 a.m., as if she'd waited for the day to end before cutting me out entirely. The walls around me were bare except for a single hook where someone else's picture must have hung once. I had only brought a suitcase, a worn coat, and a tin box of receipts that clinked faintly every time I moved it. The room smelled faintly of old wood polish and the sea that drifted through Charleston's night air. I set the phone on the table and stared at the screen until it dimmed. There was a time I would have called Ethan demanded an explanation, begged for decency. But that woman, the one who apologized first and cried in kitchens, had been buried years ago with my husband. What remained was quieter, but far less fragile. I made tea on the small stove, its flame a blue whisper against the dark. Steam rose, fogging the window as I watched the streetlight sway in the wind. Somewhere, a train horn carried over the river, long and low, a sound that belonged to leaving. I thought of the house on Ashley Avenue, the smell of sawdust from Tom's workshop, the porch light he wired himself, the laughter that once lived inside its walls. If Lydia and Ethan believed changing locks could erase me, they didn't understand what it means to build something with your hands. You can't evict the person who laid the foundation. I took a sip of tea, steadying the warmth in my chest. The anger that had simmered through the evening was gone, replaced by something calmer, sharper. Resolve. It felt like the moment before a nail meets wood, precise, deliberate, irreversible. I picked up my phone again, scrolled to the message, and deleted it. Not out of forgiveness, but because it didn't deserve to exist any longer. Then I turned off the lamp and lay down, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Tomorrow, I would start making calls. Not to plead, but to prepare. I drove past Ashley Avenue that morning, following the old route out of habit. The streets were slick from rain, the kind that turns the air silver and softens the world just enough to make memory seem close. The house appeared before I was ready. White shutters, brick steps, the porch railing Tom built by hand. Even from a distance, I could see where the paint had begun to chip. He would have hated that. Tom Marin had always said a house was a living thing. It breathes if you build it right, he told me once, running his palm along the new window frame we'd sanded ourselves. Back then, it was just the two of us, and a dream that smelled like sawdust and hope. We'd bought the lot cheap. After the hurricane, the structure half flooded and leaning. People said it was beyond repair. Tom only grinned, shoulders broad and sure beneath the sun, and said, "Then we'll just start over." For years, we did everything ourselves, nights. Spent under floodlights, patching drywall, weekends painting, until our arms ached. I handled the ledgers, the permits, the insurance. He handled the hammers, the nails, the sweat. We met in the middle at dinner, tired and laughing, the house slowly rising around us like a promise kept. Ethan was still a boy, then always barefoot and curious, dragging his toy trucks through the mud while we worked. He'd fall asleep on the steps, and I'd carry him inside, smelling of wood glue and rain. I used to think those years would last forever, that as long as we built something strong enough, nothing could undo it. Tom died 15 years ago, sudden and quiet. A heart that simply stopped mid-sentence. I remember standing in the half-finished kitchen, the sound of his tools still humming in my head. The house felt bigger after that emptier, too. I refinanced the mortgage, signed every document alone, and swore to keep what we had made standing. Ethan was in his final year of college then. Tuition notices kept coming thick as winter bills. I took a second job with a local appraisal firm, drove between properties until my wrists ached from holding the clipboard. Every check I earned went to him. When he graduated, I told myself it had all been worth it, that his future was the return on our investment. He brought Lydia home a year later. Pretty sharp, full of opinions about how things could be improved. She admired the molding, the porch swing, the wide kitchen windows, and I watched her eyes linger, not on the family, but on the space itself, the kind of look people give a place they already imagine owning. After they married, they moved in just until they saved up. I remember laughing, saying the house could use the noise of young footsteps again. They filled it quickly with new furniture, new rules, new energy. Lydia repainted the kitchen a color she called soft almond, but looked more like bone. Tom's workshop became a home office. My name stayed on every bill, every repair, but she began referring to it as their house. I didn't fight it. At the time, I thought it was love. I wanted Ethan to feel secure, for Lydia to think of me as family, not a guest in my own home. When the taxes came due, I paid them. When the roof leaked again, I hired the repairman. When Ethan's student loans piled up, I took out another small refinance. Every decision felt temporary, a bridge, until they could stand on their own. I never realized the bridge was slowly giving way beneath me. The first time Lydia suggested putting her name on the deed, she said it casually, slicing fruit at the counter. "It's just paperwork, really. Easier for refinancing later," she said. Ethan nodded along, distracted, and I told myself it didn't matter. The house was family. Family was trust. And trust was supposed to be enough. Now, as I parked across from the same porch, I saw the potted plants Lydia had arranged, the new brass number on the mailbox. Her touch was everywhere, tidy, deliberate, erasing the traces of us one surface at a time. I sat there for a long while, listening to the rain against the windshield, thinking of Tom's hands smoothing plaster, of the nights I stayed awake, balancing payments we could barely afford. I had built that house, beam by beam, bill by bill, until it stood like a second heart outside my chest. If they believed a lock could keep me out, they had already forgotten what held the walls together. It wasn't nails. It was me. It began with a stack of papers and a soft tone. Lydia had a way of turning requests into courtesies, of wrapping her intentions in politeness, until you forgot there was something sharp inside. That morning, she stood by the kitchen island, sunlight falling over her shoulder, a manila folder in her hand. "It's just minor paperwork," she said. "Some refinancing to get a better rate. The bank wants all current residents to sign. It's really just a formality." Ethan stood behind her, rinsing a mug at the sink. "It's fine, Mom," he said, not looking up. "It'll help us save a bit each month." I remember the way he said us, how it hung between us like a quiet correction. I should have asked questions then about ownership, about who the documents listed, but I didn't. I was tired that day, worn from balancing work and bills, and Lydia's voice carried the confident rhythm of someone used to being obeyed. She placed a pen in front of me, the one with the gold trim she used for signing holiday cards. "Right here," she said, smiling. "You always make things so easy." I signed. It took less than a minute, and yet I would replay that motion for months afterward, the sound of the pen scratching the faint tremor in my hand, the ink sinking into paper that would later unspool my name from the deed. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Lydia thanked me with dinner that night, a roast chicken glazed to perfection. She poured wine, complimented my scarf, laughed about the neighbor's barking dog. I almost believed we were finally becoming close. Then little by little, the air inside the house began to shift. My mail stopped arriving in the front slot and started piling in a box on the porch. The property tax statement was addressed to Ethan Marin and Lydia Marin, no longer including my name. Lydia began introducing herself to repairmen as the homeowner. She changed the Wi-Fi password and forgot to tell me. When I came home late from the appraisal office, I'd sometimes find my bedroom door slightly open, the bed covers rearranged as if inspected. One evening, I mentioned the missing mail. Lydia laughed. "Oh, I've been sorting it to make things easier," she said. "You don't need to bother with bills anymore." The way she said bother told me she had already decided which parts of my life were worth keeping. I started noticing other small things. My framed photo of Tom moved from the hallway to the laundry room, my gardening gloves gone from their hook, the spare key I kept in the kitchen drawer missing. When I asked Ethan, he frowned and said, "You probably misplaced it, Mom." But the words didn't ring true. Ethan had always been an honest man, gentle in his explanations. Now, when he spoke, I could hear Lydia's phrasing stitched between his pauses. The breaking point came quietly. One night in late autumn, I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water and stopped when I heard voices through the half-open door of their bedroom. Lydia's laughter, low and careless, drifted through. "Once it's in our names," she said, "she'll have no reason to stay." Ethan murmured something I couldn't catch, but Lydia's laugh returned lighter this time, almost victorious. I stood there, hand still on the light switch, heart hammering so loud I thought they might hear it. The refrigerator hummed beside me, indifferent to the sound of something breaking that had taken years to build. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the boxes I'd never unpacked since Tom's death. The papers, the receipts, the small symbols of a life spent believing that love was protection. In the quiet that followed, I understood the difference between loss and theft. One takes what time erodes, the other smiles while it does the taking. By morning, I knew I would have to start keeping my own records, not of kindness, but of proof. The afternoon was heavy with Charleston humidity, the kind that makes every movement slow and deliberate. I had stopped at the market on my way home, a bag of peaches balanced against my hip, and a carton of milk sweating in my hand. The house came into view just as the sun began to lean west. Its white shutters glowing, the porch light still hanging crooked from the last storm. It looked exactly the same, at least from the outside. I shifted the bags and reached for my keys. The brass ones, smooth from years of use, slid into the lock and stopped halfway. I twisted once, twice. Nothing. The key refused to turn. I tried again, pressing harder until the edge cut into my palm. That was when I noticed it, the shine of the metal new and too clean. They'd replaced it. The doorknob caught the light like a quiet insult. For a long moment, I just stood there, the sound of cicadas thick in the air, my groceries cooling at my feet. Then I saw it, a sheet of white paper taped to the front door. The handwriting was neat, unmistakably Lydia's. "Contact our attorney." No greeting, no explanation, just that. A peach slipped from the bag and rolled down the porch step, splitting on the wood. I watched the juice spread in a small, amber circle, thinking absurdly of the hours I'd spent scrubbing that same porch clean. I tried the door once more, even though I already knew it was useless. My own reflection looked back at me in the glass, a stranger on her own porch. Neighbors passed now and then, waving politely, none of them noticing anything wrong. To them, I must have looked like someone simply locked out by accident. I wanted to laugh at the thought. There was no word in the English language for being exiled from something you built yourself. I set the grocery bag down beside the swing Tom had hung years ago. The chain still creaked faintly in the wind, the same sound that used to lull him to sleep after long days of repairs. I sat there, not crying, not angry, just still. The boards under my feet were the same ones I had sanded smooth. The paint on the railing had dried under my own hands. I remembered the night we moved in, Tom insisting we toast the house with cheap champagne. "To every storm will outlast," he'd said. We did for a while. The shadows stretched longer across the yard. From inside came the faint murmur of a television, the clatter of dishes, a life continuing without me. I leaned back against the swing, feeling the wood press into my shoulders. The air smelled of salt and honeysuckle. I whispered, "You can't evict what built you." The words drifted into the dusk, absorbed by the house that still carried the echo of our laughter beneath its floors. When the first porch light flicked on down the street, I stood, brushed the dust from my skirt, and gathered the spilled fruit. I didn't take the note from the door. It could stay there as long as it wanted. I already knew what came next. The night was falling, and I walked toward it, the keys still clutched in my hand, small, silent proof of everything they thought they could replace. Janet's house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She'd been my friend since Tom's passing, one of those people who offered help without turning it into charity. When I showed up at her doorstep with 2 suitcases and a hollow smile, she didn't ask for details. She simply opened the door wider and said, "You'll stay here as long as you need." Her spare room was tucked beneath the eaves with a narrow window that overlooked the live oaks and the marsh beyond. The first night I barely slept. The quiet wasn't comforting yet. It was the kind that made space for everything I was trying not to feel. By morning, I needed something to do with my hands. Janet was already in the kitchen humming as she poured coffee. "There's still that old attic you never cleared after Tom passed," she said gently. "Might be time." The words landed heavier than she meant them to. That attic had been my time capsule, a place where I'd stored pieces of a life I wasn't ready to sort through. But now, with the house gone, I realized the past was all I had left to defend the truth. Janet fetched the key from a drawer and led me up the narrow stairs. Dust floated through the air, thick as fog, and the floorboards groaned beneath our feet. She left me there with a flashlight and said, "Call if you need me." I found the box near the back wall, hidden under an old quilt and a stack of empty paint cans. It was heavier than I remembered. The cardboard had softened with time edges curling, but when I pried it open, the smell of paper and ink hit me like a memory. Inside were years of our life in layered order: bank statements, contractor invoices, permits, and tax receipts. All in my handwriting, all in my name. I sat on the floor, the flashlight beam trembling slightly as I flipped through the documents. There were copies of mortgage payments from when Tom was sick, every check written from my account. Receipts for roof repairs, for plumbing, for the fence I'd replaced myself when the storm tore it down. Notes scribbled in the margins, measurements, deadlines, the shorthand of 2 people who once trusted effort more than luck. One envelope was marked in Tom's neat block letters, "Taxes, 2009, paid in full." His signature sprawled across the bottom, but beside it was mine, the guarantor. Proof of every shared sacrifice they'd decided to forget. I thought of Lydia's smirk, the new locks, the note on the door. They believed erasing me was as simple as a change of keys. But here in this fading box was the record of every nail, every dollar, every piece of sweat-stained devotion that had kept that house standing. I spread the papers across the attic floor like a map, tracing the ink trails of our years. Each page was a nail driven back into the frame of my story. I didn't need the house to prove it existed. I just needed the truth. When Janet climbed the stairs later, she found me sitting cross-legged among the papers. "My God, Elise," she whispered, "you kept everything." I smiled faintly. I thought I was just being careful. But as the sunlight filtered through the dusty window landing across the old receipts, I realized it wasn't caution that had made me save them. It was instinct, the quiet kind, that knows one day you might have to rebuild your life from paper. Janet gave me the number of a woman she knew from the historical district, a property attorney who she said doesn't scare easy. Her name was Anika Patel, and she agreed to meet me the next afternoon. Her office was on the second floor of an old brick building near Broad Street, the kind that smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper. The receptionist led me to a glass-walled room overlooking the street below. Inside, Annika stood when I entered, a woman in her 30s, sharp eyes, calm voice, a streak of silver already glinting through her dark hair. "Mrs. Marin," she said, offering her hand. Her grip was firm, deliberate. "I hear you have quite a story." I sat down the box of papers beside me. The weight of it left a dent in the table when I set it down. She began sorting through the contents, carefully page by page, occasionally lifting an eyebrow, occasionally jotting something down in a small leather notebook. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of paper. When she finally looked up, her voice was quiet but sure. "You've got more evidence here than most people who plan their cases for years," she said. "Mortgage payments, tax receipts, repair invoices, all from your account, all traceable. You have equity interest. They can't erase that." For a moment, I didn't answer. The words felt unreal, like hearing your name spoken in a language you'd forgotten you knew. Annika leaned forward, tapping a document with her pen. "See this line here? It proves you assumed liability when you refinanced after your husband's death. That gives you legal standing over the property. Their names on the deed don't negate your financial contribution." I exhaled slowly, feeling the tightness in my chest begin to loosen. "They'll try to frame this as a misunderstanding," she continued. "They'll hope you won't fight because you're family. But this," she gestured at the papers, "this isn't family business anymore. It's evidence." Her voice wasn't cruel, just certain. It carried the steadiness I'd been missing in my own. We spent hours cataloging the documents. She made copies, labeled them in precise handwriting, and slid them into color-coded folders. Each folder felt like a brick being laid solid, measured impossible to ignore. "Do you want to pursue restitution or full ownership claim?" she asked when we'd finished. "I want acknowledgement," I said. "What I gave, what I built." She nodded once. "Then we'll make them put that acknowledgement in writing." She stood and reached out her hand, again the gesture clean and professional. "You did the hard work already, Mrs. Marin. Now we make it visible." When I left her office, the sun was dipping low over Charleston, turning the river gold. I carried the lighter version of my box copy's notes, outlines tucked under my arm. The original stayed locked in Anika's cabinet. As I walked toward my car, I caught my reflection in a window. Tired, yes, but different. There was a steadiness there that hadn't been in months, a quiet pulse of control returning. For the first time since Tom's death, I felt the ground under my feet hold firm. They had taken my home, but not the foundation that I still owned. Chapter 8. The House That Forgot Me. It was nearly dusk when I turned down Ashley Avenue, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as the old sycamores arched overhead. The street hadn't changed, same uneven bricks, same cracked sidewalks. the same soft smell of the harbor riding the wind. But as I slowed in front of the house, something in me went very still. The porch lights were on. I'd wired them myself 15 years ago. The copper lines twisted neatly behind the beams. Now they glowed warm and steady, unaware that the person who'd given them life was parked across the street, invisible. Through the front window, I could see Lydia moving about the dining room. She was laughing, arranging silverware, her movements practiced and smooth. Ethan crossed behind her, carrying a bowl of salad, saying something that made her tilt her head back and smile. From where I sat, the scene looked almost perfect, domestic, ordinary, untouched by the kind of cruelty that strips someone from their own home. For a moment, I thought about driving away, but then I saw the mailbox. The nameplate was still there, faintly weathered but readable, Marin. My name, not theirs, not ours, mine. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly to the curb, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The evening air carried the scent of wet earth and magnolia. I reached out, brushed a thumb over the metal, and felt the fine grit of dust against my skin. The house looked smaller from this side of the street, almost fragile in the fading light. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and began to record. The mailbox, the porch, the floodlight I had installed after Tom's accident. I zoomed in on the side gate, the one Ethan and I had built together when he was 17, still learning how to measure twice before cutting once. The wood was weathered now, the latch a little rusted, but it still stood. I walked along the fence line, filming quietly. Every corner of the property held a trace of me. The handrail Tom carved from reclaimed oak, the rain barrel I'd set up to water the garden, the motion sensor near the garage that blinked red when I moved past. Evidence, all of it. Not of ownership, but of contribution of care. A dog barked somewhere down the block. I froze, half expecting Lydia to peer out the window. Instead, she kept moving, pouring wine into glasses, her laughter spilling into the night. It sounded the same as it had at Christmas dinner, bright, practiced hollow. From the street, I could see the faint outline of the living room walls. The portrait of Tom was gone. In its place hung a pale, abstract canvas, clean and impersonal. I stood there realizing how easily people could rewrite a space, how paint and silence could erase a history if you let them. The sky deepened into violet. The first stars blinked through the branches above, and the porch light flickered, casting a faint pulse across the yard. That flicker used to bother me. I'd meant to fix the wiring, but never did. Now, watching it from a distance, I felt something unexpected, a pull, not of grief, but of ownership, a reminder that every imperfection still carried my hand. I took one last video, the camera catching the shimmer of light on the brass doorknob, the very one Lydia had replaced after changing the locks. Its shine was cold, almost taunting. But the reflection that flashed in it was mine, not hers. Back in the car, I set the phone on the passenger seat. The recordings were simple, quiet, factual, nothing sentimental about them. Still, my chest ached as I started the engine. The house slipped out of view in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing softly against the dark. It was strange realizing that a home could keep breathing without you. But as the road curved away and the porch light vanished behind the trees, I understood something deeper. It wasn't the loss that hurt. It was seeing the life I built continue pretending it never knew my name. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and cold air. The walls were paneled in wood, darkened by time, the kind that reminded me of my father's church when I was a girl, quiet, expectant, with judgment hiding somewhere in the silence. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Anika, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Lydia adjusted her blazer, her lipstick a shade too bright for the morning. Ethan sat beside her, his shoulders drawn in his gaze fixed on the table before him. The clerk called our case, the sound of my name echoing in the room. Elise Marin versus Ethan and Lydia Marin. I had imagined this moment so many times, but hearing it aloud still sent a shiver through me. The people I had loved most in the world were now names on the other side of a legal complaint. Lydia's lawyer was a man in his 40s, with a polished accent and a smile that belonged in a brochure. He began smoothly, his voice full of practiced sympathy. "Your Honor, this is at its heart a family misunderstanding," he said. "My clients never intended harm. They merely sought to formalize ownership of a property already in their care." I watched Lydia nod along, her hands clasped demurely on the table. Her ring sparkled each time she moved. The lawyer went on about good faith and household transitions, words that dressed betrayal in civility. Anika waited until he was finished, then rose with calm precision. Her tone was measured, her movements slow. She opened the binder we'd spent weeks preparing and began to speak not with emotion, but with evidence. "Exhibit A," she said, sliding the first set of papers forward. "Mortgage payments made solely from Mrs. Marin's account for 12 consecutive years, including the 6 years following her husband's death." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The rhythm of her statements carried their own weight. "Exhibit B," she continued, "invoices for roof repair, electrical rewiring, and plumbing maintenance, all contracted and paid for by Mrs. Marin. Each includes her signature and itemized receipts." The judge leaned forward slightly, flipping through the pages Anika handed over. His expression gave away nothing, but his pen began to move slower. "Exhibit C," Anika said, a notarized acknowledgement signed by Mr. Ethan Marin, confirming temporary repayment arrangements to his mother for covering the 2015 mortgage installment during a financial hardship. At that, Lydia's head jerked toward Ethan, his jaw tightened. For the first time since I'd entered the room, she seemed unsure of herself. Anika closed the binder softly, her final words simple. "Your Honor, my client does not seek to take what isn't hers. She seeks recognition for what she built, maintained, and sustained alone." Silence filled the room. The judge glanced between both tables, then set his pen down. "The documentation is clear," he said. "However, given the familial nature of this dispute, the court recommends mediation before further proceedings." A murmur rippled across the benches behind us. Lydia's lawyer nodded politely, pretending it was the outcome he'd hoped for. But Lydia's smile had gone brittle. Her hands now clasped too tightly, her knuckles pale against the fabric of her sleeve. When the judge stood to adjourn, Ethan's eyes lifted to mine for the briefest second. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, paler, a man, shrinking beneath the weight of his choices. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. There was a part of me that still searched for the boy who once helped his father carry beams through the summer heat, laughing when sweat rolled into his eyes. That boy was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't meet my gaze. Outside the courthouse, the light was sharp, the sky washed clean after a night of rain. Anika walked beside me, her folder tucked under her arm. "It went well," she said simply. "Better than expected." I nodded, though the words felt far away. My legs ached, but not from the walk, from the years of bending, carrying, holding things up that others had let fall. Behind us, I caught a glimpse of Lydia through the courthouse glass, standing too close to her lawyer, her face pale beneath her makeup. Ethan trailed a few steps behind her, looking lost. For once, I didn't feel pity, only distance. Anika held the door open for me, the air outside warm and heavy again. "The next step is mediation," she said. "But I think they're beginning to understand what they've done." I looked toward the street, the courthouse steps fading behind us. The river glinted just beyond the building's bright, and steady. It was the same water that had once carried Tom's laughter through open windows, the same tide that had beaten against our foundations and found them strong. Now, standing in the sunlight with proof on my side, I understood something simple and unshakable. They had underestimated what I had built, not just the house, but myself. The grocery store was almost empty, the air thick with the smell of detergent and fruit, left too long in their bins. I had stopped in for bread and tea, ordinary errands on an ordinary afternoon when I saw him. Ethan stood by the self-checkout sleeves rolled to his elbows, a basket hanging loosely from one hand. For a moment, I almost turned down another aisle. But he looked up, and our eyes caught before either of us could pretend otherwise. He smiled awkward and uncertain the way people do when politeness has to stand in for love. "Mom," he said, his voice too soft, too rehearsed. "Hey." I nodded. "Hello, Ethan." He stepped closer, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear us. I noticed how tired he looked, the faint lines under his eyes, the slump in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Guilt has its own kind of gravity. You can see it even when no one speaks of it. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. Neither did I. We stood among the aisles like strangers meeting in a borrowed world. The hum of the refrigerators filled the silence. He shifted the basket to his other hand and cleared his throat. "Lydia said you're making this ugly," he finally muttered. There it was, the sentence he hadn't been able to avoid, the message sent on someone else's behalf. I looked at him, really looked. The boy who once built tree houses in our backyard, who used to come home with scraped knees and apologies ready on his tongue, was gone. In his place stood a man unsure of who he was allowed to defend. "Truth isn't ugly, Ethan," I said quietly. "It's overdue." He swallowed hard, staring at the floor tiles. For a second, I thought he might argue. But he didn't. He only nodded once, the smallest of gestures, then said, "Lydia doesn't mean to hurt you. She feels like you don't trust her." "I trusted both of you," I said. "That's how we got here." A flush crept up his neck. The fluorescent lights above us flickered, humming faintly. The sound reminded me of the porch light back home, the one that never stayed steady. He looked as if he wanted to reach for me to bridge the distance, but his hands stayed at his sides. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said. "Neither did I replied. "But here we are." We stood there, the silence between us too heavy to break. Shoppers passed carts, rolling by, their conversations blurring into background noise. At last, Ethan took a step back. "I should go," he murmured. I nodded again. "Take care of yourself." He hesitated, then walked away without looking back. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, letting in a wash of warm air and traffic noise. I stood for a while, watching the place where he'd been, my hands resting on the edge of my basket. The bread felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of something neither of us could say. When I finally left, the sky had turned a bruised gray. I walked to my car slowly, the sound of his voice still echoing in my ears, not the words themselves, but the emptiness between them. The mediation office sat on the top floor of a quiet building near the waterfront, its windows facing the slow shimmer of the Ashley River. It was the kind of place designed to feel neutral white walls, muted art, soft lighting meant to calm tempers before they had a chance to rise. But my pulse didn't listen to the decor. It beat slow and deliberate, like a hammer finding rhythm. Anika met me in the hallway, holding her leather portfolio against her chest. "Stay factual," she murmured. "They'll expect emotion. Don't give it to them." "I don't have any left," I said, though we both knew that wasn't true. Inside the room was cool and bright. The mediator, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Halverson, sat at the head of the polished table. Her expression carried the calm of someone who had watched families unravel before breakfast. On the opposite side, Lydia and Ethan waited. Lydia's perfume reached me before her words did, sharp, expensive, unyielding. She offered a smile that didn't travel beyond her lips. Ethan avoided my eyes, his fingers tracing the edge of a folder. Mrs. Halverson began with pleasantries, explaining the process. "This is not a courtroom. We're here to find mutual understanding." The phrase landed like an apology for something she couldn't prevent. Lydia leaned forward first. "We never wanted conflict," she began, her tone carefully measured. "This situation just escalated. Family isn't a contract, Mrs. Marin. It's trust." Anika didn't look at me. She simply waited, letting the silence hang. I reached into my bag, pulled out the binder, and placed it on the table. The sound of it hitting the polished wood was louder than I intended. Slowly, I opened it, sliding the first section toward the mediator. "Then why," I said evenly, "did you write me out of one?" Lydia's eyes narrowed, her practiced calm beginning to fray. Anika spoke next, her voice smooth but firm. "My client has provided detailed records, bank statements, payment confirmations, notarized receipts. Every line item shows direct financial contribution to the property in question." She passed a copy to the mediator. "In total, Mrs. Marin covered more than 60% of all costs after her husband's death. We're seeking equitable restitution for those contributions." Mrs. Halverson studied the pages, her glasses sliding down her nose. "This is extensive," she murmured. Lydia crossed her arms. "I don't see how old bills prove ownership," she said, trying to sound composed but missing the mark. "They prove responsibility," Anika replied. "And responsibility has legal value." Ethan shifted in his chair, his face pale. "Mom," he started, but Lydia cut him off. "No, Ethan, she's twisting things." She turned to the mediator, her tone sharpening. "We invited her to live with us. She contributed because she wanted to help. We never forced her." I looked at her then, steady. "You didn't have to force me. I loved my family." That was enough. The words hung there for a moment. Lydia's mouth pressed into a thin line. Ethan lowered his head, his thumb running over his wedding band. Mrs. Halverson flipped through the binder again. "Mrs. Marin," she said quietly to Lydia, "these records are thorough. We will need to discuss fair compensation." Lydia straightened, color rising in her cheeks. "So you're saying she's owed money for being generous? I'm saying generosity doesn't erase contribution," Mrs. Halverson replied. The room went still. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. Lydia's lawyer, an older man with kind eyes who had stayed silent until now, cleared his throat. Perhaps, he suggested carefully, it's best we move toward practical terms. A settlement could avoid further legal expense for everyone. Lydia's shoulders stiffened. She glanced at Ethan, searching for support, but he looked away. The silence between them said more than any argument could. Anika leaned toward me. "They're cracking," she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The tide had already turned. Mrs. Halverson outlined the next step property appraisal repayment schedule, acknowledgement of equity interest. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes flicked toward me, once soft with understanding. "Let's talk numbers," she said. Lydia sank back in her chair, her expression blank, but her knuckles white. The control she'd held so tightly for years was slipping one document at a time. When the session ended, we stood. Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't know it would go this far." "Yes," I replied, gathering my papers. "You did." Anika touched my arm lightly, guiding me toward the door. Outside, the late afternoon light was bright enough to make me squint. The air smelled of salt and summer rain. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding my breath until I exhaled, slow and steady. Behind us, the door closed with a soft click. It was the sound of something ending, not loudly, not violently, but completely. 2 days after the mediation, the storm finally broke. Not outside, but inside the walls Lydia had built for herself. She sat at the kitchen island, her phone buzzing beside a half-finished cup of coffee. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, soft and pale. For once, she wasn't dressed for perfection, just a gray sweater hair pinned up carelessly. Ethan stood by the counter reading the newspaper without seeing a word. The chime sounded again. Lydia reached for the phone, expecting another message from her real estate client or a delivery update. But when she opened the email, her breath caught. From Harold R. Briggs, attorney at law. Subject: urgent case status update. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled. We've reviewed the evidence provided by opposing counsel. Mrs. Marin's documentation establishes equitable ownership under state property law. She can prove contribution and liability through financial records receipts and notarized acknowledgments. I strongly advise immediate settlement to avoid a formal ruling in her favor. For a long time, she didn't move. The clock ticked above the stove each second, dragging louder. When she finally looked up, Ethan was watching her. "What is it?" he asked. Lydia swallowed. "They're saying your mother can prove everything." He blinked, confused. "Prove what?" "That she owns part of the house," Lydia said, her voice thin. "That she paid for it. That she's not just claiming." Ethan stepped closer, his face paling. "We told her it was just paperwork," he whispered. "We promised." Lydia slammed the phone down, the sound sharp, against the marble. "You promised," she snapped. Then her voice softened, unraveling at the edges. "You said it would stay simple." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. The color drained from his face as the truth settled between them, quiet, undeniable, irreversible. He didn't defend himself. He didn't speak. He just stared at the phone as if it were a mirror reflecting everything they'd chosen not to see. Outside, the wind stirred the oak leaves along the porch, brushing against the windows in a low, restless rhythm. For the first time since they'd changed the locks, the house felt unsteady, as though it finally remembered who had built it. The courthouse conference room was colder than I remembered. The air smelled faintly of paper and old carpet, the kind of sterile scent that clings to bureaucracy. I arrived early, clutching the pen Annika had given me, a simple black fountain pen, heavier than it looked. She said it signed better under pressure. The long oak table stretched between us like a quiet battlefield. Lydia and Ethan were already seated on the far side, their lawyer beside them. Lydia wore navy again, her hair wound tight at the nape of her neck, every strand deliberate. Ethan didn't look up when I entered. His hands were clasped together, knuckles pale. Anika nodded to me from her chair, calm as ever. "You ready?" she asked softly. "Yes," I said, and I was. The clerk laid out the final documents in neat, symmetrical stacks. The settlement agreement, the release of claims, the written acknowledgement of contribution. Each page looked plain, almost harmless, but every line had been weighed and fought for. Mrs. Halverson, the mediator, joined us for the signing. Her eyes met mine briefly, a quiet kindness there, as if she understood what victory without joy feels like. "We'll proceed in order," she said. "Defendants first." Lydia reached for the pen, her hand steady, though her jaw tightened. The scratch of ink filled the room as she signed her name again and again. When she finished, she placed the pen back on the table without looking at me. Ethan followed his signature, smaller, hurried, as if he wanted the moment to end before it began. When the documents reached me, the paper felt warm from the weight of their hands. I read each line one last time. The undersigned acknowledges the financial and structural contributions of Mrs. Elise Marin to the property located at 84 Ashley Avenue. Said contributions confer an equitable interest to be compensated by settlement in the amount mutually agreed upon. The phrasing was clean, legal, devoid of sentiment. But I felt Tom's presence in every word. He'd built walls with wood and sweat. I had rebuilt ownership with proof and patience. I lifted the pen. The tip pressed into the paper with a faint resistance, and the ink bled through just enough to show permanence. My name curved across the line, steady and final. The silence afterward felt heavier than applause ever could. Anika began collecting the signed copies, her movements precise. Funds will be transferred within 3 business days, she told Lydia's lawyer, who nodded mechanically. Once complete, Mrs. Marin's equity will be released in full and the acknowledgement recorded with the county. Lydia gathered her purse, her expression unreadable. "We've done what was asked," she said to no one in particular. Her voice held the same brittle politeness she'd used when she first called me Mom. Ethan stood slowly, glancing toward me. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes, though, were different, no longer defensive, just tired. He looked at me not as an opponent, but as a reminder of what he'd lost by choosing silence. "Take care of yourself," I said quietly. It was all there was left to offer. They left without another word. The sound of their footsteps faded down the hall, leaving only the rustle of papers and the faint hum of the air vent. Anika turned to me, a small smile softening her face. "You did it," she said. I nodded. "Justice doesn't need noise." She reached for my hand. "No, but it still deserves to be witnessed." Outside, the late afternoon sunlight poured through the glass doors, reflecting off the polished floor like water. I stepped into it, feeling the warmth climb slowly through my coat. For the first time in months, my shoulders loosened. I walked down the courthouse steps, each one lighter than the last. The city smelled of salt and damp leaves, the promise of rain still hovering somewhere in the clouds. Across the street, a magnolia tree had begun to bloom early, its petals pale against the fading sky. The house on Ashley Avenue no longer belonged to me, at least not on paper. But what I had reclaimed was larger than walls or deeds. It was proof that even after being written out, I could still sign my name where it mattered. The knock came just after sunset, when the marsh outside my window was turning from gold to gray. I almost didn't answer. Few people knew where I lived, and fewer still had reason to find me. But something in the rhythm of that knock-hesitant familiar made me set down my mug and walk to the door. Ethan stood on the porch shoulders, hunched against the wind. He looked smaller than I remembered his face. Drawn. His shirt wrinkled, as if he hadn't cared enough to iron it. Behind him, the evening light stretched across the marsh, pale and quiet. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. I opened the screen door and stepped aside. "Come in. It's getting cold." He entered cautiously, like a guest, unsure of his welcome. The small cottage smelled of cedar and the faint spice of the candle burning on the counter. He looked around, taking in the mismatched furniture, the half-read books stacked by the armchair, the narrow kitchen where I'd learned to enjoy solitude. "This place suits you," he said softly. "It does," I answered. "Coffee." He nodded, and I moved to the stove. The percolator hissed, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. I didn't ask how he'd found me. I already knew Janet had a forgiving heart, and Ethan still knew how to sound like a son when he needed directions. When I handed him the cup, he held it like something fragile. "Lydia moved out," he said after a moment. The words dropped heavy into the air between us. "I see," I said. She said she needed time to think," he continued. "She's staying with her sister in Savannah. The house feels different." I sat across from him, the steam from my coffee curling upward, like the breath of something alive. Houses do that, I said. They remember who's missing. He looked up, then searching my face for something approval, sympathy, a trace of the softness he once counted on. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said. I thought we were doing the right thing. Lydia said it was just paperwork, that it would make things easier. You didn't want to see, I interrupted gently. That's not the same as not knowing. He bowed his head, fingers tightening around the cup. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't cruel. It was the kind that holds truth until it settles. I've been thinking about Dad a lot, he said quietly. About how he built that house. You kept it standing after he was gone. I never said thank you. You don't need to, I replied. You were young. People mistake love for permanence. You learned the difference. He nodded, eyes shining. Are you angry with me? No, I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. Anger's too heavy to carry this long. I hope she finds peace. I paused, watching the marsh darken outside the window. I already did. Ethan let out a shaky breath. For the first time in years, he looked at me without defense. The boy I'd raised flickered behind his tired eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, then closed it, simply nodding. When he left the porch, light caught him in its glow for a brief second before the darkness took him back. I watched his car pull away, the headlights winding along the narrow road until they vanished into the reeds. The house fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache. I rinsed our cups, turned off the kettle, and let the stillness settle around me like something earned. The new house sat at the edge of Charleston, where the streets thinned and the marsh grass began. It wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a small porch, and a yard that caught the morning light, but it was mine. The deed, the mortgage, the name on every paper, all mine. No shared signatures, no unspoken debts, no hidden clauses tucked behind family smiles. The first day I walked through it, I could still smell the old paint and the faint trace of salt carried from the nearby river. The walls were bare, uneven in places, but they echoed gently when I spoke, like they were already learning my voice. I started slowly. The realtor had offered to recommend contractors, but I refused. I needed to do this with my own hands. It wasn't about saving money. It was about reclaiming what the years had tried to take from me. I spent a weekend repainting the living room, a soft cream color, the same shade Tom once said reminded him of early light. Each brushstroke steadied me. My wrists ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from work freely chosen. By Sunday night, the walls looked clean again, the smell of paint sharp and alive in the air. The next morning, I unpacked Tom's old tool belt from the moving box. The leather had dried and cracked along the edges, but it still held its shape. I ran my fingers over the worn buckle, remembering how it once hung from his hips as he whistled through repairs. I cleaned it carefully, then hung it on the hallway wall beside the light switch, a quiet monument to everything he'd built, and everything I was still learning to rebuild. Outside, I replaced the porch light myself. The wiring was simple. My hands remembered how. When the bulb flickered to life, a warm circle of light spilled across the steps. It reminded me of the one I'd left behind on Ashley Avenue, but this time it didn't burn for anyone else. By evening, I opened the windows to let the air move through. The curtains lifted gently, brushing against the fresh paint. I could hear the low whistle of the river wind, the hum of the city far enough away to feel like another life. I set a cup of tea on the windowsill and looked around the quiet room. The furniture didn't match the floor, still creaked, but none of it mattered. The house didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to hold me without condition. When the light outside began to fade, I reached for the new key on the counter. It was small silver, unscarred by years of use. I turned it over in my palm, feeling its cool weight, then slid it onto my keyring. It didn't replace the old ones. It simply took its rightful place among them. I locked the door for the night, the latch clicking softly into place. The sound was simple, ordinary, yet it echoed deep in my chest, steady, certain, alive, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The letter arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, tucked between a utilities bill and a gardening catalog. The handwriting on the envelope stopped me where I stood. It was unmistakable. The same careful slant Ethan had used on birthday cards as a boy. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down before opening it. The paper was folded twice the edges, slightly smudged, as if he'd handled it too long before letting it go. "Mom," it began. "You were right. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight I hadn't expected. We forgot who built everything. The house, the family, the things that held us together. Lydia's gone for good. She says it's for the best. Maybe she's right. I don't know how to fix what's broken, but I wanted you to know. I see it now. I see you." There was no signature beyond his name. No apology written in full, just that one small truth standing where excuses used to be. I read it twice, tracing the letters with my thumb, feeling the faint imprint of the pen pressing through the page. Then I folded it carefully, not because it hurt, but because it didn't need to anymore. I walked to the small chest in the corner of the room, the one where I kept the few papers that still mattered. Inside were mortgage receipts from years ago, each stamped paid in full, each one proof of the life I'd carried when no one noticed. I slipped Ethan's letter beside them, the ink and the old paper, touching as if they belonged to the same story. Outside, a breeze moved through the open window, carrying the faint scent of rain from the marsh. The sound of the porch light hummed softly, steady as a heartbeat. I sat there for a while, not thinking of what was lost, or even of what might return, but of what remained, a quiet kind of peace, shaped by years of work, forgiveness, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes love doesn't need to come back to be real. A year passed quietly, the kind of year that doesn't rush to be remembered, but leaves its mark all the same. The house had settled into itself. The walls no longer echoed when I spoke, and the garden, once sparse, had begun to bloom with small bursts of color, even in winter. It was Christmas Eve again. The same date, but a different world. The air outside carried the soft chill of the river, and the neighborhood was lit with scattered decorations. Tiny white lights trembling in the wind wreaths on doors, the faint sound of a carol drifting from somewhere down the street. I'd baked a small loaf of bread earlier that day, the smell of it still lingering through the house. A single card sat on the table beside my cup of tea, one from Ethan, simple and unsigned, except for the words, "Thinking of you this Christmas." It was enough. Some things didn't need to be fixed. They just needed to rest. As evening deepened, I stepped onto the porch. The wood beneath my feet was smooth now, sanded and painted in soft gray, the same shade Tom once chose for the old house long ago. The lamp by the door weighted its glass, polished the bulb new. I reached for the switch. The light came alive instantly, warm, golden, steady. It spread across the small yard over the fence and out toward the quiet street beyond. It wasn't a signal or an invitation. It didn't mean waiting or hoping or missing anyone. It simply meant presence. I stood there for a long moment, watching the glow settle against the dark. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring slow and solemn, rolling over the marsh. "This light isn't for waiting anymore," I whispered. "It's for peace." The breeze moved gently through the trees, carrying the sound of the bells until they faded. The warmth from the lamp reached the edge of the steps, brushing the hem of my coat. I felt it in my chest, steady, unhurried, alive. Inside, the clock ticked toward midnight. I turned from the porch, leaving the light burning behind me, its glow spilling into the night like a quiet promise that no one needed to come home to keep.